If you learned that a very common assessment tool you might be using is making learning much more shallow, is discouraging risk taking, and is shifting the focus from learning to grades, would you reconsider its use? Prescriptive rubrics do all those things, but they don't have to be used in the way they are. There are other options. Welcome to another Learner's Mindset discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnick, and my esteemed colleague is.
Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
Today we're going to be exploring rubrics, talking about rubrics, and looking at their effectiveness, what are they used for, and actually what problems do they cause? Oh, rubrics cause problems? Well, actually they can. And they're a very, very widely used tool in education, and we use them, and yet the research shows that while they can contribute to some positive aspects, there's some significant negative aspects of rubrics that we often don't address. So are you intrigued by where we're going? And any initial thoughts on rubrics? What are your thoughts on rubrics before I go down my rubric tangent?
Yeah, sometimes I find rubrics can be so prescriptive and that it makes, just experience with our learners not be able to think outside of what that rubric contains. So I think this conversation discussing rubrics and how we can break outside of those little boxes that the rubrics have in those columns to really help people think on their own and develop something that's meaningful to them is an important conversation we need to have, especially with the new culture of learning and where we're going with education and how things are changing to give learners more autonomy.
Yeah, it is an interesting conversation to have, and it's one that isn't really happening. If you were to take a look at the literature on rubrics, there is very little. There isn't a lot. It's a given. It's what everybody does because you've got very prescriptive list of what you want the learner to do. So much so that students often don't even bother looking at assignment instructions, and they look at the rubric in terms of what they need to do. So the research in the late 90s and early 2000s pointed to the fact that while rubrics do contribute to higher grades, they do because they're prescriptive. They outline exactly you do A, B, and C, and you'll get this grade. So rubrics do actually lead to higher grades. But what they also lead to is vacuous or empty writing and vacuous or empty approaches to what the learners are doing. So some of the research is showing that the students do well because they check things off the box, but they're really not thinking about what they're doing. And unfortunately, most of the research on rubrics has been done in the area of writing. And when I say unfortunately, is that there's not a lot of work that's been done in other areas. But in terms of writing, rubrics were used in writing across the curriculum type programs, and rubrics have been used in writing in a way to organize or not organize, what would you call it? Have interrelated reliability in terms of standardizing the way that writing would be graded in writing intensive programs in undergraduate schools or undergraduate programs. You want to have a consistent evaluation of writing, and so rubrics were used in that area. Then those rubrics are also used in K-12 in a consistent way where you've got standardized marking that is done on writing so that there's a consistent way that students are evaluated. So the rubrics really came out of that need for standardization, consistent marking, consistent grading, and that need for standardization. And what the research pointed to is that while they did actually solve the problem, that you can actually have a very consistent form of assessment because if a student checks off A, B, C, D, E, well then they're going to get X number of points for each one of those things that they checked off. Well, you've got a consistent grade. But what the researchers started to find is that students ignored the reflective practice. They stopped thinking about what it is that they were writing, and they just looked to check things off the box. And so the writing became, as one researcher, Mayberry referred to in 1999, the writing became vacuous. It became empty. It didn't say anything. It checked off the boxes. It sort of hit the mark, so to speak, but it was empty. There was really no insight. There was no creativity. So rubrics do work, but as a consequence, they have the result of limiting creativity, vacuous writing, and putting students in a position where they're just checking off the box as opposed to thinking and reflecting and learning and finding their own voice, which is essential to deeper learning. What are your thoughts about what I've shared so far?
I see it very clearly. What you're talking about is a short-term benefit of a grade at the consequence of a long-term benefit of reflection and thinking, and really being able to grow and learn from what you've experienced. So, students might ask, or anyone might ask, well, if we don't look at the rubric and we look at the instructions, does it now shift from looking at the rubrics to tell me what to do to the instructions? This is where it's key that the instructions are open enough and fluid enough so people can make the work that they're doing authentic to themselves and something they can actually carry out in their organizations. So having that shift in focus is so important. And this is why, we are an outcomes-based program, and we have to keep our rubrics a bit open so that these authentic projects that folks are working on can be things that they can carry out, shift, adjust, and need. We want them to be creative. We want them to experience and have fun with what they're doing. At the same time, experiment, test their ideas, challenge different assumptions about what they believe and what others believe about what they're able to do, right? And this is what makes, the DLL program particularly unique. So I think moving the shift to more open-ended rubrics and open-ended instructions will turn it from a teacher-centered, sort of program and learning experience to learner-centered. And that's a shift we need to make if we want to get our kids ready for life and our learners, and even in our program, ready for life, and not just, as we say, a test. Thoughts?
I think you've raised a really good point, and there are some consequences that we are facing with our current use of rubrics and using them as checklists. And the first consequence is that when students come into our program and they see that our rubrics aren't used as a prescriptive device, and we're using our rubric as more of an open, flexible marking guide because we use authentic projects. Because we use authentic projects, we can't spell out every single detail like most people are accustomed to. And so students who are accustomed to that prescriptive format of a traditional rubric are all of a sudden uncomfortable because they know to look at the rubric, and they know if they want to get the A, they check off these boxes. And now they have to go and look at the instructions, and nobody is prescribing to them exactly what they need to do. Our students are quite smart, and especially A students, are students who are high achievers because they've learned how the system works, and they know that the rubric is their tool to get them the grade that they want, because that's their job. Their job is to get the grade they want to get into university, and so on and so forth. And I'm not being negative about that. It's very, very pragmatic. There's nothing wrong with that. And so students who are used to that really get uncomfortable with a more open rubric. And actually, they're uncomfortable with projects altogether because they're not used to having that freedom and flexibility. But there's also another problem that happens if you have students who have been exposed to openness, to actual project-based learning, who live in a world of outcomes-based instruction, who recognize it's what they create, it's what they're working on that is really important, and how well what they've created is going to serve a need of their particular audience or solve a particular problem, which is a true evaluation or true assessment of how well or how successful they were with that project. When you have students who are used to that openness, who are used to taking ownership, who are used to having the freedom to choose the direction that they want to go, and you give them a prescriptive rubric, it actually handcuffs them.
Yeah.
Not only does it handcuff them, it can actually frustrate them. And I want to share, actually, before I share a little story, any thoughts on that, about the frustration that some students are used to doing things in a more open way experience? Because I do have an interesting little anecdote I can share, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in first.
Yeah, I keep thinking about the feedback component to these open-ended rubrics. When our rubrics are a bit open-ended, I can personalize what I'm saying back to the student. And then what happens whenever I do that is we start to build that relationship or that rapport back and forth. So while the rubric is a bit more open-ended and flexible for what their learning needs are, I can then personalize again my feedback to them. And then they'll drop me an email or drop me a line and say, "Thank you. I really appreciated that simple comment on that in that little rubric space." So what happens is when you talk about frustration and fear behind that is you use that rubric to develop a relationship, not just really the rubric, but the feedback that goes onto that rubric, to develop that relationship so that you can take that frustration and that fear down several notches. So that's really one of the great benefits of not being constrained by such a tight rubric, is I can personalize the feedback that they're getting.
I think you've really hit on something wonderful, and it's a great transition into my anecdotal story in terms of having the freedom and the flexibility and having that relationship that allows you to personalize feedback or instruction and guidance and direction. That is extremely important. So here's a story. If you've been listening to any of our learners mindset discussions, I'm in an ongoing experiment with my two boys. My younger son is a young businessman. He's got a business where he customizes cars and wraps cars and does a variety of things. And right now we're working through a business process methodology or formula that is part of Michael Gerber's E-Myth. There's a process that he goes through. And so I've been working with my younger son, Caleb, to look at his vision, look at his marketing plan, look at his organizational structure. There's about 8 different components that you have to address as you plan out your business. And so we're going through these on a weekly basis or on a regular basis, and we're doing certain things. And so he's been reading the books, and I've been reading the books. I've been reading a little bit more than he has. I'm a researcher, so I read everything, right? And I'm consolidating some ideas. Well, a couple weeks ago, or actually a few weeks ago, he realized that he has to expand his shop, and he's got to hire some people. And so he realized he really has to build out his organizational chart. He has to take a look at where he's going to be with his business down the road. And he came to me and he said, "Yeah, Dad, listen, we need to do that org chart part, that section of the E-Myth." And I said, sure, no problem. Let me look at the material that's there. So I dug into the book, and I dug into other resources online. And I took a look at what would be the right way, or what would be a prescriptive way, or what would be the rubric way of going through this process. And so I took a look at a variety of resources, and I took a look at the recommendation from Gerber himself, and he outlined the process in a certain way. And he was very prescriptive in terms of what you needed to do. And so I met with Caleb, and I started to take him through the rubric, or take him through the prescriptive steps that he had to follow. And very quickly, Caleb became uncomfortable. And he says, "Well, Dad, that's not really what I'm thinking. I was thinking about this and that and a variety of other things." And says, "Well, okay, no, that's right, Caleb. What you're talking about is down here in step 4, but we have to do steps 1, 2, and 3 according to Gerber first." He says, "Yeah, but Dad, right now I'm living in step 4. And if we do these other steps, that's something that I haven't been thinking about. And I know we're going to get there, but can't we do this one first?" And I says, "Well, really, when you're looking at it," we went back and forth, and it only took, actually, I'm getting better at this. So it only took me a few minutes to recognize that it really didn't matter where we started in the rubric. It didn't. It really actually didn't. And the fact that Caleb had an idea of where he wanted to go, and if we started with where he wanted to go first, it put him at ease, and he was creating the context because he had a real world application that he was dealing with. We're not doing this theoretically. He's building a business. He lives this every single moment of every single day. And so going through a methodology that is somewhat theoretical is one thing, but if you're living it, if you're living the project, you can do things differently. And I very quickly realized, yeah, we didn't have to actually start with the first step. We could actually move down to that 4th step where he was at. And we dealt with what he was concerned about. And then we went up to kind of what the rubric indicated, and it made all the difference in the world. So it took me a few minutes to recognize his discomfort in doing that. And because we had that relationship, and I listened to him, and I recognized my role was to be a coach, a guide, a mentor, not to dictate, well, this is the way the book says we need to do it, so this is what the rubric says, this is how we do it. We didn't need to do that. And so a very rigid rubric, which is what a rubric really is, can often force people like my son who live in the realm of authentic projects to become uncomfortable and limit the progress. If I would have proceeded down that path, I don't think we would have accomplished what we accomplished, because I shifted, got a sense of where he was at, and I says, "Well, where do you want to start? What do you want to do?" And then he pointed to, "Well, let's do this first, and let's do this." And we bounced around a little bit, but by doing what he wanted to do, we were able to do everything that we had intended at the beginning, but in a slightly different way and in a way that made a difference to his real world. So when you're dealing with authentic projects, the project needs to dictate what you need to do, not the rubric. And if you hold too closely to the rubric, you're going to kill the creativity. And not only kill the creativity, I think you're going to frustrate people who are recognizing, yeah, the book says this, but the real world says this. So I think as an instructor, you have to fall back on that relationship you have with a learner, get a sense of where they're at, and recognize your coach, your guide. And in that coaching and guiding, you've got to get a sense of letting go of the prescription and have enough sense to let that learner, right, dictate where they want to go. And then you coach and guide them, knowing ultimately where the destination is. So again, rubrics can be really hampering if we hang on to them too closely. So what are your thoughts about this anecdotal experience?
I think it's a great example because it clearly articulates to me that when you are invested or involved in the project, right, you set the context. And then the rubric sort of just become, it's almost like it sits over here and yeah, you're going to go back to it, but your real project, that is what's preparing you for life ahead. If you think about it, no one hands you an instruction book on life and says, here's the rubric, here's how to get through it. Here's how to build a business, and here's how to be a perfect student. Really, the rubric, sure, it can be a guideline. It can be something that you look at for, consult. But when you make it your own, you do exactly what Caleb did. You kind of move things around and shift things around a bit to make this work in the real world. So you set the context when you own the project. On the flip side of that, if you don't own what you're doing and you're going through the motions, you need to rely on a rubric to tell you what to do, because you're not exactly thinking in terms of bigger picture, authentic innovation plan, and for yourself. That's a clear distinction. And it sometimes it takes us a little while to get there and to see that, some folks, it'll take us a little while to get there. So it's one that you kind of have to keep working at and working towards to make that shift. And then when you really own it, rubrics are sort of okay, I'll take a look at that, but I really have this wonderful idea over here. And maybe, I should touch on this theory because this is a seminal work, or, that they kind of become on, part of it, but they're not the focus of it. That's the big difference. And, it's really hard. Let me just say this too. Sorry. It's really hard for us to come alongside and coach and help and facilitate people who are really focused on, hyper laser focused on a rubric, because then we're helping them do what? Meet the rubric? Well, they can do that. We want to come alongside and focus and help people who are doing authentic projects in the real world that we can help them. Oh yeah, you might trip up here. Let's rethink this. Ooh, take a look at this. Have you thought about this? Have you read this? And then they can come back with us and have those real contextualized conversations that are genuine and will help people move their ideas forward. My thinking.
I think you've really touched on a couple more really important points, and that is when the students get caught up in the rubric, they are doing so because they want a grade. So in one sense, they're looking at getting the highest quality grade, or quality, if we want to use that terminology. They want to do the best, right? They want to achieve the most, achieve the highest grade. Well, the focus on the grade becomes the focus of the rubric. And it's divorced from the focus on learning. And it's easy to jump through the hoops and get a grade and have very, very poor quality. It really is. But when you own what you're doing, the quality or the success or the achievement becomes part of that process. And here's another continuation of the anecdotal story. As my son is developing his business, because he's focused on quality, because he's focused on setting himself apart from all other people that he's competing with, and his aim is to help others achieve their aesthetic vision of what they want for their sports car, or whatever the case may be, because he's invested in helping people to achieve their vision. And his success really comes when others people's dreams are realized. He's got a very high standard. You don't help other people achieve their dream through a checklist. You do so by meeting with them. You do so by understanding what their vision is. You do so by helping them to realize that if this is what you're looking for, if this is your goal, if this is how you want your sports car to be perceived at the car show, or this is when you walk into your garage that morning, before you go to work, and you look at this vehicle and it says, "This is me." Well, that isn't achieved through a rubric. That isn't achieved through a checklist. That
Mhm.
is achieved through really developing that vision through almost an artistic and a technical endeavor. And it happens through communication, collaboration. So my son is always working with the owner and always, contributing parts of his vision to the owner's vision. And it becomes this collaborative endeavor where his success is the realization of his customer's dream, his customer's vision, right? You can't checklist that. And so when he's successful, he has established collaboration, communication. He's established all these things that lead to his success. But he also realizes that in doing so, it takes time, it takes effort, and his work has to cost more than other work. And so he's willing to give up, the race towards the bottom, having the lowest possible price, because he doesn't want to compete in that type of environment. He doesn't want to limit himself and limit his artistic expression. He doesn't want to limit who he is because he's helping people achieve dreams. Well, can you put a price tag on dreams? Yeah, you have to be reasonable in terms of price, but because he's looking at doing something real and authentic, that whole limitation of a checklist really can lead to poor quality work, because there's a lot of companies out there that, well, we'll do this, we check all these things off the list, and they hire people to help you do all those things off the list, and the quality is not the greatest. So ironically, rubrics and these very specific prescriptive checklists leads to lesser quality, and the research is clear on that. So Alfie Cohen has looked at this in the mid 2000s, and he points to several researchers. I've taken a look at the research as well, and again, I'm going to repeat something I mentioned earlier. Sure, you can get a higher grade in terms of the score, but the quality of work, the quality of writing, the writing in these research examples, the researchers call it vacuous. It's empty. There's no substance. And when you're writing, if there is no substance, there is no passion, well, then the writing really isn't going to move anybody or isn't going to do anything. And so you can get a score, but what does that score really mean? So the rubrics actually ironically lead to lower quality work. Despite the fact that a student can get the grade that they want, the quality of work isn't there because they haven't really learned. They haven't gone deeper. They haven't taken ownership. And the rubric actually prevents you from taking ownership because it's somebody else's checklist. Here, I've done all this. It doesn't really matter. It's like, cramming for the test and then exhaling when the test is done. Research on this is clear. Sometimes students will do okay on a test, but if you were to test them a month later, they'll do horribly because they haven't retained anything. They'll do okay by cramming. Okay, not great, but if you want students to go deeper in their learning and really develop a thorough understanding, rubrics actually get in the way. Thoughts on that?
I think you've summed this up. I think both this conversation has really covered everything that we were thinking about, rethinking rubrics, if you will. So I don't have any final comments.
Yeah, the last comment I do have is I've been looking at this now for since the late 90s, and I took a quick peek at the research again the other day. I think we might need to actually look at a research project where we explore this and revive this type of thinking, because we are doing something in education that I think is detrimental to a lot of learners. And this dependency that we have on rubrics, I think, is limiting not just creativity. I think it's limiting the potential that we have for our learners in terms of preparing them for life. So yeah, a rubric can help them prepare for the test, but it's not going to help them in preparation for life. And I think with our COVA plus CSL or CSLE plus COVA approach, our goal is to create those significant learning environments and give that learner choice, ownership, and voice through those authentic learning opportunities. And that prepares them for life, also prepares them for the test. I think we need to go down that path. I think we owe it to our learners to revive that type of thinking. So, another research project might be in the wings. So,
Let's get started.
yeah, let's get started. And we'll leave that for another discussion. So, thanks.